Hello gathered friends, I'm Harora Nuva, and welcome to Bionicle Deep Dive, where we analyze the tropes, characters, and lore of LEGO Bionicle. And today, we are going to be diving into an infamously controversial topic in the fandom: romance and love in the Bionicle story. Anyone who's been in the fandom long enough knows that love isn't canon has been memed to hell and back. But as much as it's been discussed, I honestly think there's still a lot more nuance and interesting angles to the topic to discuss. So I'm going to be diving into the discussion with as much breadth and depth as I can muster, looking at it from three important angles: the in-universe canon, the behind-the-scenes thought processes of the writers, and the ways the fandom engages. This video was originally supposed to come out on Valentine's Day, but due to a mix of unexpected life stuff as well as getting way deeper into this topic than I originally imagined, it ended up coming out late. This topic ended up being so interesting because honestly, the unusual and often inconsistent ways Bionicle handled the topic of romance really ends up holding a fascinating mirror to the ways we think about romance in the real world. So, let's dive right into it. Part of the reason why the topic of romance in Bionicle is so contentious is that there isn't even a clear-cut yes or no answer to the question of, does Bionicle have romance in it? Because you can't just say yes, because you have the numerous statements, infamously by Farshtey, but also from other members of the story team, that the characters don't engage in or even feel romance. But you also can't flat out say no, because there are tons of moments with characters engaging in mild flirting with each other that are clearly meant to invoke the idea of romance to the audience. But even then, nothing further ever comes of these romantic hints. The characters never get together, and there are non-romantic explanations for them. So it gets understandably confusing. And with a subject people feel as passionately about as romance, there has been some very heated debates among both the fans and between the fans and Farshtey. While other fandoms are having discourse about who should end up with who and whether certain ships are healthy or problematic, we're here having vehement arguments about whether or not the concept of romance even exists in this fictional universe. Now, I feel like the best place to start is actually the end, by which I mean Farshtey's final statement on the matter that he gave in 2015. Normally, I'm firmly in the camp of look at the story before the statements, but I'm making an exception here because it's actually such a good place for setting expectations for the rest of the discussion. It's his most detailed and thought-out statement on romance in Bionicle, and I think it's really important for everyone to see, because I don't think everyone has, and he explains himself really well here. It's a post he made specifically to address it, as opposed to his other answers on forums where he was just giving brief, off-the-top of his head answers to dozens of fan questions. I'll read the quote in verbatim. Today's topic is another one of those thorny Bionicle issues: romance in Bionicle. Both I and the Bionicle team caught a lot of heat for not putting romance into the stories. I'm not going to go into the story-based reasons for not doing it, because you have all heard those before. So let me sort of do an FAQ on this. 1. Was there ever romance in the story? Yes, in some of the online games, and there were hints of it in the third and fourth movies. 2. Was there ever a discussion among the story team about whether or not to include romance in the story? Not in any meeting I am aware of. No one was making a case that we should do it, no one was asking us to include it, therefore no one ever had to make a case against it. Scholastic, for example, could have asked us to include it in the books, but they did not, for reasons similar to the ones I will get to below. 3. Did I make the decision there would be no romance in Bionicle? No. I never had the authority to make a unilateral decision like that. If the story team as a whole had wanted it, it would have been in. 4. Why wasn't romance included in the Matoran universe? It certainly adds things to other stories. Yes, it does. And the story reasons for not including it could have been gotten around. But there was also a demographic reason not to include it, and it was the same reason Scholastic did not want it. Although the story was aimed at 10 to 11-year-olds, the target for the sets and the books was 8-year-old boys, 3rd graders. Get a bunch of 3rd graders in a room, as we did, and ask them about romance stories, and the answer you get is, yuck! And their mother's reaction was, why does the presence of a female character automatically mean there have to be romance? The decision that this was not the way to go was based on research, not hunches. the story could get aged up, but not so much that we alienate the target. And so, that is Greg's definitive final statement on romance and Bionicle. And we'll be discussing each of those points he made, as well as some points he didn't make throughout the video. So let's start off with looking at what we see in the Bionicle story as presented, those hints of romance that Greg mentioned. We're going to break down the discussion of what's in the story into two sections. First, the general lore about how the biomechanical MU inhabitants work and how that would impact their relationship to romance. And the second part will be about the specific instances in which the idea of romance was invoked in the character relationships. So, the general background lore about the Matoran universe inhabitants, or more specifically topics that intersect with romance, was revealed to us subtly over its run, and by the end paints a full picture. The Matoran and other biomechanical species were artificial creatures created by the Great Beings to serve as maintenance drones on the inside of the Matanui's giant robot body. Their creators always intended them to be capable of intelligent problem solving, but they were never meant to have feelings or deeply care for one another. That obviously changed, as over the course of their 100,000-year history, they developed complex emotions and cultures, and deep bonds of genuine friendship with each other, as well as being capable of greed, animosity, and violence. They became a new, fully sapient people, far beyond what their creators intended or even dreamed of. But despite of how deeply human-like they were, there were still some key differences between the Matoran and real-world humans that informed aspects of their cultures. And relevant to the discussion of how romance would have been depicted in Bionicle are the differences they had with respect to sex, gender, and reproduction. And we're going to go into a bit of a tangent about those topics in the real world, but trust me, I'm building to a point. Now, obviously, among real-world humans, sex, gender, and reproduction aren't necessarily a part of romance. People get into same-sex relationships. Some people are asexual, but may feel romantic attraction and get into relationships without feeling any sexual attraction. Some aromantic people get into sexual relationships without feeling romantic attraction. Many people of all orientations decide to live in relationships without having kids. And gender roles and dynamics aren't the same across cultures or throughout history. Romance doesn't have to have any of that. It really can just be that intimate, close bond between people. But while not intrinsically connected for everyone, when we look broadly, these topics are often grouped together in our cultures because they are connected for the majority of people. The majority of people are straight and have children, and that majority shapes the dominant cultural narrative. And that narrative is that people are supposed to engage in romance with someone of the opposite gender, get married, have sex, and raise kids together. This is the essence of what's known as heteronormativity, the idea that this is the normative, correct way to live. And even people who don't fit the heteronormative mold are still living in a heteronormative culture that shapes our ideas of what relationships can and can't be. And while we've made great strides in the continuing fight to accept more types of people, we do have to acknowledge that Bionicle came out in the early 2000s. At that time, there was a slowly growing tolerance of queer people in mainstream media coming off of the intense homophobia of the 1980s. But unfortunately, same-gender romance was still considered taboo for kids' stories, and wouldn't make prominent appearances in children's media until the mid-2010s. What this means is that if romance was going to appear in Bionicle at that time, it was almost certainly going to have been heteronormative to a large degree. So it's really interesting then that the Bionicle story team chose to design the Matoran in a way that made heteronormativity impossible. Matoran don't reproduce through any biological means, sexual or asexual. How new Matoran come into being was deliberately kept a mystery throughout the series, though it was confirmed in guidebooks that it could happen on Metronui, but not on Matanui. In any case, to the Matoran, the idea of adding new members to the population was completely divorced from their personal relationships with each other, as opposed to humans who make new humans through sexual relationships. The lack of reproduction also means they don't have sex, and also lack sex organs or even sexual dimorphism. There aren't any real physiological differences between male and female Matoran. while they do have a concept of gender, gender works far differently among them than it does among humans. For one, gender is determined by element, meaning all Matoran of one type are all the same gender. There were also far more male elements than female elements. Of the 6 main elements we see in this story, only one, water, is female, and the rest are all male. On Motunui and Metunui, each elemental tribe lived in its own village or district, meaning each village had a single gender population. There wasn't a balanced enough ratio to form straight couples, and they all lived apart, so unless they wanted to give every Gamatoran a harem of 5 long-distance boyfriends, straight romance just wasn't going to be a thing for the population at large, and that was obvious. Over the course of the series, the number of elemental tribes increased to about 16, but the gender ratio still remained very lopsided. Gender was also purely psychological, and also not really a big deal to the Matoran at all. While there were some gender stereotypes about water Matoran being gentler, which obviously maps onto human stereotypes about women being gentler, overall, there were more differences between the elements than there were between the genders. What this means is that not only do the Bionicle characters as individuals not fit the heteronormative model, their whole culture logically wouldn't even have the same background assumptions and social structures of relationships that we've built around heteronormativity. And that was clearly very intentional on the part of the writers, that these fictional beings break from our culture's assumptions, which I find really interesting. Their species doesn't work the same way as ours, and there's a reason for that. Because all of this was world building that was built around and subtly foreshadowed that they were all parts of a larger machine, the Great Spirit Robot. The story team felt it was important to their role as parts of the machine, as well as the general mystery of the series, that how New Matoran came into being shouldn't be revealed. New Matoran could come into being on Metunui, but not on the island of Motunui, showing that the island wasn't their natural environment. When they were created, it was to fulfill a specific job and purpose within the larger machine. They weren't coming into being simply to exist like we humans do. It's kind of how, you wouldn't want the pistons in your car to start getting together and making little baby pistons that the engine wouldn't have room for. This is one way in which the story team leaned more heavily into the mechanical aspect of the Matoran universe and less into the biological aspect, since Motunui was meant to be both a machine and a body. Real biological cells reproduce asexually all the time, growing and splitting into nearly identical copies. They do this because the cells in our body regularly die and so need to be replaced. So, in order for Matoran to regularly reproduce like this, they would also have to die regularly. And they went the opposite direction in the story. Matoran don't die regularly. Death is a bit of an abnormality to them, and they can live for extreme lengths of time unless they're killed. It is interesting to think about how the series would look if the more cell-like reproduction model was used. Because if Matoran regularly died and needed to be replaced, then Makuda's immortality could actually be used to serve the cancer metaphor he filled. Cancer is a disease where a group of a body's cells stop dying to make room for new ones and keep themselves alive and redirect resources to them at the expense of the rest of the body, much like Makuda did. So perhaps Makuda finding a way to make himself immortal and as a result crashing the body could have been a very interesting way to approach the metaphor. I'm going on one heck of a tangent off the original topic of romance in the story, but I hope I've made it clear how it's all an interconnected part of the various themes of the story. So that's the Matoran universe in general, and it gives us important context to the discussion. But now let's shift and actually look at the character relationships throughout the series, and how they relate to romance. So, over the course of Bionicle, there were 6 main character relationships that I think we can all agree were obviously meant to invoke the idea of romance. There were plenty of other moments fans have latched onto that are a bit more ambiguous about writers' intent, but these 6 are the instances where there can really be no doubt that's what they were going for. And interestingly, we can kind of group them into 3 categories. The very cute, almost schoolyard crush relationships of Maku and Huki and Jalar and Pali as Matoran on Motunui. The mildly more sexual yet one-sided attractions of Matau and Nokama and Rudaka and Sidorak in the Metunui era. And the canonically confirmed yet tragic romances of Kina and Motunui, and Samad and his lover on Bara Magna. So let's go through each of them. The first is Huki and Maku, the OG couple in Bionicle. Their relationship was first introduced in the Matsunui online game, and was almost exclusively featured in Templar and web content like the Borak animations. Their relationship is defined by a lot of mutual care and concern for each other, as well as lots of cute little moments of affection. The first we hear about their feelings for each other is after Takua helps save Gakoro. Maku is worried about Huki because she heard there may be trouble in Pokoro, but Dragon Okama has forbidden her from leaving the village for her own safety, knowing that she often leaves the village to spy on Huki. Supposedly, they would bond over their love of sports and occasionally play pranks on each other, like when Maku soaked Huki's mask, which apparently startled him so bad he shattered a boulder with his head. You can also see in Maku's hut a little signed poster saying, "To Maku from Huki, with love." Maku begs Takua to go check for her, and when he arrives in Pokoro, he finds that Huki has fallen ill to the plague that swept through the village. Huki begs Takua not to tell Maku that he's sick, so as to not worry her. Next we see of them is during the Borak animations, when the Pomatorn are forced to evacuate to Gakoro after their village was overrun. Huki and Maku wave to each other while their Turaga talk, prompting Anawa to bonk Huki on the head to keep him focused. Bro, they thought they were sick, but everyone knew. Huki then saves Maku from a boulder launched by Parak with a shot that redefined the sport of Koli. Later that night, we get a scene that is the absolute peak of their ship. The two of them are sitting alone on a lily pad. Huki is anxious that the Parak might return, and Maku tries to comfort him. She holds his hand, and he blinks and stares at her. Shooting stars flicker behind them as Maku slowly leans in for what looks like a kiss, only to be interrupted by Jaller and their friends. The two then scoot away from each other and blush hard. During the battle, they're seen looking out for each other. And later, after the battle, Maku affectionately takes Huki's arm and drags him to swimming lessons, much to his dismay. In Matsunui Online Game 2, we don't see them directly interact, but we still do see signs of their relationship. When you enter their homes, they have little plushies of each other, which, can I just say, is literally the cutest thing in the world. Like, your OTP could never. After that, we don't see much of them together. They don't interact much in Mask of Light outside of competing against each other in Koli. Huki goes on to be an even more prominent character as a Toa later on, and Maku kind of fades into the background and stays behind in Metro Nui. Huki does note that the swimming lessons he got from her probably saved his life in Mare Nui, as normally toe of stones sink like rocks in water. Huki didn't talk much about her while on his mission, and Nuparu even noted that. Huki replied that he's trying to stay as focused as he can on the mission so he can get back home to see her and their other friends as quickly as possible. He missed her deeply, but decided that focusing on his sadness would only slow down getting back to her. Unfortunately, we don't actually see them interact once the Toomari return to Metro Nui. Actually, we don't see much of the reunions and relationships of the Toomari at all when they return. For example, we actually never see Jaller and Takanuva interact at all when they're both Toa, leaving fans to fill in the blanks with fanfiction. But so, we see that Huki and Maku's relationship is mostly played as a mix of caring friendship and early crush. No serious romance, the closest they get is looking like they'll almost kiss, but it's interrupted as a gag. But what they do have is cute little moments that hint at feelings as well as a genuine bond of companionship. Now we go on to the second major quote-unquote couple in Bionicle, Jaller and Holly. Jaller and Holly are very similar to Huki and Maku in terms of their vibe, very mild, cute hints of flirting and feelings, as well as a genuine bond of care. Like Huki and Maku, we first see them together during the Templar content, this time at the end of the Borak animations. It's only a few seconds interaction, but as Jaller says he's about to head home to Takoro, Holly quietly comes up to him, takes a flower from her mask, and puts it on his. Jaller and Takua stare after her for a moment before Jaller decides to stay in Gakoro for a little bit longer and runs after her. We next see them in the Matsunui Online Game 2, where the player plays as Holly and prepares for the Koli tournament. When visiting Takoro, Holly actually causes Jaller to get flustered and stammer. Also in the game, when Holly visits Kokoro, a seer tells her a prophecy that says she will bring the island together, but the one she loves will be destroyed, which later comes true with Jalar's death later in the arc. The bulk of their shipping moments come from the first movie, Mask of Light. They have some playful banter with each other during the Coley match where Jalar's like, "Nothing gets past the captain of the guard, unless he wishes it." Which, like, what does that even mean? Like, it's played as flirty, almost innuendo, but what is he even innuendoing? "Ooh, baby, I'll let you get past my guard later tonight." Like, what? And she's like, "I'll keep that in mind." I mean, later in the match, she does actually score on him to win the game, so that might have been what she meant, but, like, we all saw that. Later on, we see them have a short scene together before Jalar goes on to leave for his quest, where Holly tells Jalar not to get mushy on her. Jalar says she owes him a rematch on the Coley field, and she tells him to hurry back because she'll be practicing, and it's definitely giving the vibe of both of them trying to play off their feelings. The scene is honestly played up even more in the novelization that describes Jalar having to gather his courage and wondering if he'll ever see her again. He also notably stares off after her as she walks away with her hands on her hips and has to shake his head to get back in the moment. Vakama also clearly sees this, and his expression seems to say he thinks it's kind of cute. All in all, what we're seeing of Jalar and Holly comes across as very good friends who were just coming to terms with a developing crush on both sides. At the same time, we have to admit that a big part of the reason why we interpret Jalar and Holly as romantic is because one is a boy and one is a girl, and our society has very heterosexual assumptions about interactions. Jalar and Takua are just as, if not more, affectionate, caring, and quippy with each other, and yet they're interpreted as best friends, while Jalar and Holly are interpreted as flirting. And again, as many Bionicle shipping fans has noted, Jalar has two hands. We see Holly again after Jalar's death. She is often seen holding on to his mask. She only parts with it to put it on Takanuva's vehicle, but even then she sneaks aboard and continues to carry it to Makuta's lair. When she returns to the surface, she invokes his memory when she calls the island together, and you can hear in her voice how much she cared and respected Jalar. And when Jalar's revived at the very end, she rushes to embrace him. All of this showed a deeper care to the affection that they showed each other early in the movie. And it's also really interesting thinking about it from a production timeline standpoint, because the script for Mask of Light and the majority of the voice recording was done in 2002, before the Borak animations and Minog 2 came out. This means that the hints of something we saw in the online content were likely put there to get in more alignment with the movie. After Mask of Light, we do still see Jalar and Holly interact, and they're still very close, but the more crush-like undertones are played down. They still care about each other a lot, and will playfully quip with each other, but it comes across as much more friend-like. They're clearly the closest of the Toa-Nika Toamari. Honestly, one of the hardest hitting moments they have is while they and the other Toamari are holding off the Baraki's armies to buy Matoro time. Jalar decides in desperation to try and pull off a fire Nova Blast, hoping that it will be enough to stop the Baraki and let Matoro escape. He tries to tell the rest of the team to leave him behind and get out of range, but they choose to stay and defend him to give him a chance to charge the blast. And Holly tells him that they fought together for 1,000 years, and they'll die together if they have to, which, oh my god. The entirety of Downfall is just an absolute knife twist in the feels. So, with Holly and Jalar, we see them start off as a very cute, almost schoolyard crush like Hyuki and Maku, though it evolves into a dynamic of very deep care and companionship. It's played as kind of romantic at first, but still able to be hand-waved as just a really close friendship, and not like a full adult-like romance. Alright, so next we go on to Matau and Nokama. But if we're being real, it's really just Matau. Oh, Matau. Ranked number 1 horniest Bionicle character on my last Valentine's Day special, and I stick with that rating. Matao was constantly flirting with or attempting to impress Nokama, who mostly just kind of brushed him off as a joker. Apparently, Nokama is incredibly crushworthy, considering the obsession her student Vizola had with her as well. However, it wasn't just shallow flirting on Matao's part. In Challenge of the Hordika, his internal monologue says that he thinks of her as a good friend and hopes they could be even more than that, all while he's desperately trying to save who he thinks is her. Matao also consistently shows genuine care and protectiveness of her, such as his grief when she was poisoned by the Rahinui and his joy when she was healed. And for her part, Nokama does genuinely care about Matao and has put herself in danger to protect him. She just doesn't return his flirting. In the Legends of Mechanui movie and novelization, Matao says he sees them taking a romantic ride drive, which proves that the word romantic does exist in the Matoran universe. And that's really interesting because it means in spite of everything, some version of the concept of romance does exist in the MU. However, this isn't that out of place when we consider that they also have some version of the concept of familial relationships, despite not having biological families. Toa constantly refer to each other as brother and sister, and Makuta even refers to the Rakshi as his sons, showing that the words connected to the concept of reproduction exist, even though it doesn't exist in the same way it does in our world. Matao himself is also such an interesting case because he kind of single-handedly muddies the common argument that Matoran might have romantic bonds but don't feel sexual attraction, because of a comment he makes in the novelization of Web of Shadows. In the book, he talks about how, while keeping watch, he had a strange urge to make a nest, and Nakama admits that since their transformation into Tohordika, she's been having unusual urges too. And in the most out-of-pocket moment in the series, Matao asks her if any of her urges involve him. Do any of your animalistic urges involve me? I challenge any of you to find me an interpretation of that line that isn't meant to be sexual innuendo. At best, you can argue it's just from the Hordika transformation and not feelings they normally have, but still. In any case, the romance and attraction here is still largely treated as a gag. Haha, Matao's down bad for Nokama, but she brushes him off. It wouldn't be until the next pairing that hints of romance would have their first and only instance of major plot relevance. That pairing is Rudaka and Sidorak. Sidorak was the king of the Vizorak horde, with Rudaka as his viceroy. The two had a long rivalry over winning Makuta's favor, and Rudaka despised Sidorak for stealing credit for her victories. However, Rudaka was a skilled manipulator, and through flattery and very obvious flirting, in the movie at least, got Sidorak to view her as a trusted ally, and he wanted to make her his queen. This blinded him to her plot that eventually came to fruition with her tricking Sidorak into fighting Kitangu, who killed him. Sidorak and Rudaka are notable for being the only truly plot-relevant romance in the series. Every other instance of romantic hints in the series were really just background tidbits that could easily be removed or ignored because they didn't really affect the overall story. But Rudaka's manipulation and betrayal of Sidorak was central to the resolution of the Hordika arc, as the two of them were the main antagonists, and it led to both of their defeats. Sidorak directly through his death, and Rudaka being abandoned by the Vizorak army for her treachery. Rudaka and Sidorak's arrangement is also explicitly referred to as an engagement and a marriage, which obviously implied that marriage as a concept and institution does exist in the Matoran universe. This further pokes holes in the idea that the reason romance didn't exist in the MU was because they wouldn't have a reason to establish the societal structures around it. The explanation given for marriage, as vaguely outlined in the Web of Shadows novelization, is that it is a political alliance, where each spouse would permanently gain each other's social status. Rudaka would be elevated to Queen of the Vizorak, having equal command over the Horde and rendering their rivalry over Makuta's favor pointless. And in turn, Sidorak would gain Rudaka's considerable social standing on her home island of Zia, a major weapons and technology manufacturer. This arrangement of marriage resembles most closely the feudal European institution of marriage between nobility, which were mainly arranged as a means of securing alliances and preserving wealth, status, and titles. Somewhat fitting, considering what Greg Farshtey would often note that getting married primarily for romantic reasons was a relatively recent phenomenon in our world. In many places across human history, the focus of marriage was primarily family building, through having children and uniting the couple's families into one bigger, extended family. But, that's not to say spouses didn't often have an intense loving bond, and that their bond with each other didn't play a major role in the decision to get married. It did. But in so many cases, the primary focus was the family, as shown by the global prevalence of arranged marriages. And add that to the role of marriage played in titles among nobility, given that, while often not truly equal, wives of nobles did at least share their husband's title and status, which is what we saw with Sidorak and Rudaka becoming king and queen. Now, I kind of want to speculate more on marriage within the Matoran universe. It's hard because this is literally the only example and it's never brought up again, but given its plot importance to Web of Shadows, we can't just ignore it. One thing I wonder is which cultures in the MU practice marriage? Because it doesn't seem like the Matoran do, and when you think about it, even the political alliance version of it wouldn't really make sense to them. Matoran society was largely equal, with all Matoran a part of the working class. The formal ruling class was limited to Turaga, and ascension to that rank could only be achieved if a Matoran became a Toa, fulfilled their destiny, and then gave up their powers. While there is a bit of a caste system where certain jobs are only available to certain elements, there isn't really a hierarchy between the elements. They're regarded as equally important. Certain job titles carried more prestige, but anyone could get promoted if they had the skill. There wouldn't be a point to this conception of marriage because status in a Matoran society was based solely on what job you did and how well you did it. You couldn't become a mask maker by marrying a mask maker, and you certainly couldn't become a Turaga by marrying a Turaga. Not to mention that Matoran greatly valued unity, and as a whole were all on the same side, so making personal alliances against each other wasn't encouraged. But this concept of marriage does make sense for Sidorak and Rudaka's cultures. Sidorak is a Steltian, and Rudaka is a Vortic. Both of these cultures are intensely hierarchical and cutthroat. Both Sidorak and Rudaka gained additional prestige from betraying some of their fellows. It would make sense for there to be a societal mechanism to secure alliances between people you trust and transfer status in those places. The Vortex in particular are also notable for having gender dynamics in their culture that the Matoran do not. Vortex society has a gendered hierarchy, with women leading and men having lower class jobs. It may be inferred that they have a more balanced gender ratio than Matoran, given that an important rite of passage in their society involves a male and a female pair climbing up the carnivorous mountain and back down again. Marriage might be a way for a male Vortex to raise his status. Bringing this up because, again, at the time Bionicle was released, any marriage in the story would have probably been male-female. That said, a Vortex lesbian power couple sounds like something out of a dream, or a nightmare. Something else I literally just realized while writing this is that Rudaka's dialogue at the end of Web of Shadows kind of implies that she wanted to marry Vakama. She says, "And to think I thought you could be king." At this point, Rudaka was already legally the queen of the Visorak, having ascended from viceroy to the death of the king rather than through marriage. Vakama was still just a field commander, so for him to be king, under the established system, he would have to marry her. Which is absolutely hilarious, yet also kind of consistent with her constant seductive flirting towards him. Like, I'm pretty sure she still thought Vakama was going to be submissive to her and follow her lead, but the fact that she was willing to share some power with him when she didn't necessarily have to does kind of say something. I'm definitely willing to believe she genuinely thought more highly of him than she thought of Sidorak. That's obvious. Sidorak was a buffoon, but Vakama was actually really intelligent when he wasn't blinded by his self-worth issues. She'd have an effective ally that could be more easily controlled through guilt, as opposed to Sidorak, who could only be controlled by ego-inflating flattery. With guilt, there's less likelihood they'll think of themselves as higher than you and work against you. All of this is made funnier by the fact that By all appearances, Rudaka's flirting went straight over Vakama's head. Like, Vakama was drawn in because his mental health was in a death spiral, and she offered him an out of the burden of being a hero, but he never actually reacts to her more seductive moves. Sorry, girl. He's just too depressed and asexual to pick up what you're putting down. I'm starting to understand why Greg said that he would have preferred if Matau was the one who betrayed the team. Because Matau understands horny. Could have gone with the angle that after all that time striking out with Nokama, he's finally presented with someone who can match his freak. But so, when comparing the Metronui era romances to the romances in the previous era, we do see some interesting distinctions. While the Matoran romances on Matsunui more closely resembled wholesome puppy love friendships, the Metronui era were at least a little more sexual, though obviously still saying firmly PG. They were also notably more one-sided, with Nokama not reciprocating the type of feelings Matsuo had, and Sidorak believing the attraction was mutual, but was actually just Rudaka playing him. And so these hints of romance shift away from cute to a bit more cynical, while still being mostly a gag. Now, the final two romances come years later at the very end of the series on Bara Magna. These are interesting because it was confirmed that the Bara Magnans, the Glatorian and Agori, are naturally occurring organic creatures that do have sexual reproduction and also a concept of romance. In the first case, which was somewhat ambiguous in the books, but Greg later explicitly confirmed, was Kina developing feelings for Matsunui. These feelings were pretty evident in their last scene together before Matsunui took over the prototype robot, with Kina not only worried for Matsunui, but also scared that going forward everything would be different between them. Kina struggled not to cry in front of him, and as she rode off, the narration says that the sands that had never known rain were kissed by her tears. Greg was dropping bars in the last book, like, it's unappreciated. It's unknown if Matsunui reciprocated her romantic feelings. Even Greg said it was unclear. However, it cannot be disputed that he cared for her deeply, calling her one of his closest friends. And to be fair to Matsunui, friendship was a very new emotion to him, and he still had a lot on his mind at the time, so he could be forgiven if he hadn't quite gotten to romance yet. The other Bara Magnan romance we see was between Shamad and the woman he loved, that died during the dreaming plague that destroyed the Iron Tribe. This one is interesting because it is the singular, indisputably canon, unambiguous romance presented in the story. But despite that, there's really not much else to it other than what I described. Shamad's lover doesn't even get a name, and nothing about their relationship is described other than the fact that Shamad loved her. Her death continues to haunt him in the present in his nightmares, and her death, along with the rest of their people, was a part of Shamad's motivation to become a slaver in revenge against the rest of Agori society. The one romance in the series, and it's just the dead wife trope. It is interesting that between this and Kina and Matsunui, we have instances where there were genuine confirmed romantic feelings by beings that do have romance and sex as a part of their culture, but they both end tragically, with one of the love interests dying, or in Matsunui's case, going dormant. To me, this really reinforces again how much Bionicle as a story just isn't a romance. And even when there aren't lore reasons to say why they can't, the characters just don't end up together in the end. The existence of romantic feelings and also sexual reproduction on Bara Magna does raise more questions than answers, and unfortunately the series ends before we can get any answers from the story itself. We don't see anyone in an actual romance, and there's no child characters on Bara Magna. Parenthood was never described among them. Like many things with Bara Magna, the lore was left largely underdeveloped. Greg and the rest of the story team knew by that point that Bionicle was about to be abruptly cancelled, meaning there wouldn't be much point to develop the world like that anyways. But I can't help but wonder what their culture surrounding romance would look like. It's clear that at least Bara Magna characters shown weren't concerned about romance. Greg said in an online statement that romance between an Agori and a Glatorian could happen in theory, but it was rare and likely taboo. Given their extremely long lifespans, I can imagine they don't feel as pressing urges to reproduce, since there's less need to replace their population. Even more so after the shattering, considering how strapped for resources they were, more mouths to feed wouldn't be good, especially if they could already just live that long. Gresh, who Greg stated was a child before the Core War, is a young adult 100,000 years later. So if their childhoods are that long, it just wouldn't be worth it to have a lot of dependent kids on Bara Magna. The science of Glatorian aging and life cycle is an interesting topic in its own right. It sure would be cool if there was some science-themed Bionicle YouTube channel I could collab with to make that video. Now, while we're discussing the presence of romance in Bionicle, I guess it would be remiss of me to not mention romance in the rebooted Generation 2 continuity. And they handle it pretty normally, to be honest. Romance exists in the G2 universe, it's just not a big deal. There's no romantic subplot, the Toa don't have any love interests, they're just focused on other things. It just exists in the background. The Akotan villagers get married, they even have kids. The Protector of Jungle is shown having a wife and son, and it's said that the position of Protector is inherited from parent to child. The gender element dynamic doesn't seem to be a thing. There's male and female Akotans from all villages, though the gender ratio among the featured characters is still the same from G1. They really handled it so unremarkably in G2. Romance, marriage, reproduction, they all exist, they just aren't in focus. And the normalcy with which Generation 2 handles the topic honestly makes G1 feel insane by comparison. Like, in hindsight, if G1 didn't want to include romance in the story, they could have just gone this route, had it exist in the background, but just don't give the characters romantic subplots, and people really might have been okay with that. But instead, what we end up with in G1 was a story where the characters sometimes seem to have romantic-themed subplots, while the creators vehemently deny that the concept even exists in this fictional universe. But if I'm keeping it 100, I actually still prefer how G1 did it. Now, I'm not saying this because I agree with every decision G1 made about romance and the related topics. I don't. I think they could have handled it a lot better. But the way G2 does it, there's really nothing special. We can just fill in the blanks with our assumptions about the real world. On the other hand, G1 Bionicle subverted expectations about romance, sex, gender, and reproduction, and they did so in order to subtly tell us things about the Matoran. All of it together is used to paint a picture of a people that are a bit alien to human assumptions. The way it handled romance was one part of the way it handled the Mastoran species in general. And it was weird and kind of messed up, but god damn it was fascinating. Like, the way G2 handled it, you couldn't make this whole long-ass deep dive talking about it. But G1 chose to go strange and controversial in a way that makes it endlessly fun to pick apart in your brain, and I love it for that, even if I don't agree with everything it did. But back to the topic of this video. When looking at all the instances of romance in the series as a whole, particularly in G1, we see that while passing references to the idea of romance could happen, it wasn't something Greg or anyone else on the story team wanted to explore in depth, through things like having the characters actually date or get together. Which I think is a good place to segue into the out-of-universe side of this, and why, from a writing perspective, the idea of romance was handled the way it was by the story team. Which of course means we need to dive into the infamous Greg statements. The questions of, would there be romance in Bionicle, were asked since basically the inception of the Ask Greg Farshtey online forums back in 2003. And his answer was pretty consistent, that he didn't see a point in having romance in Bionicle since it couldn't go anywhere. He acknowledged that hints of it happened in the web animations from Templar, saying that it was something the webmaster thought was cute, but Greg said that not everything from the games and animations were story team approved. And what he meant by couldn't go anywhere was that actually exploring romantic relationships with any kind of depth or prominence was a direction that the story team just wasn't really going to go, for a couple of reasons. The first was the lore reasons we established earlier, that the Matoran don't reproduce and therefore don't do anything associated with it. Greg talked many times about how the story team was very adamant that the way New Matoran came into being should be left a mystery and that they don't reproduce. And Greg argued that since they don't reproduce, they wouldn't have an intrinsic desire to form the kinds of romantic pairings we see in humans, nor would they develop the societal structures and expectations built around romance. And a lot of fans have rightly pointed out that plenty of people enjoy romance without sex. Though I do think Greg may have had a point, even if he presented it awkwardly. The Matoran were perfectly capable of having extremely deep and meaningful bonds with each other, that's not in question. And if we really think about it, in our world, romance really is a very specific kind of structure for a personal relationship to have. It's not just about the two people in the romance caring about each other, it's also about how they present to society at large, and the assumptions that come with that. That very specific structure developed in our society to fulfill a very specific societal role, family making. And even though plenty of people enter into the structure of romance without necessarily trying to make a family, we have to wonder if that structure would exist at all in a fictional society without that kind of pressure. I mean, why would they develop romance? Even though they can clearly develop new feelings that weren't programmed into them, what reason would they have to develop the specific kinds of pair bonds we see in humans when they can just have platonic relationships that are just as deep and as meaningful as romantic ones? Something to think about. And very interestingly, Greg said at least a few times that while the concept of romance wasn't present in the Matoran universe, he didn't preclude them from being capable of learning about it on Spheres Magna when interacting with the Glatorian and Agori, who did have romance. I definitely enjoyed the thought of Huki and Maku discovering the concept of dates and realizing that's basically what they've been doing this whole time. We have to examine our expectations from the real world. Because while romance can and does exist without heteronormative assumptions, if we remove all of them, all of the assumptions about what romance is supposed to be, many find defining romance to be difficult. And especially when we remove heteronormativity from the background cultural context, like with Bionicle, what can we pinpoint that makes a romantic relationship different from a deep and committed friendship? And this leads into something I think is really important to talk about even outside of Bionicle, which is how we as a society tend to elevate romantic love above all other kinds of love. Because that plays a big role in why the romance debate was so heated. Consistently, Greg said that they specifically don't form romantic relationship dynamics, but they still love their friends. And yet there was a notable portion of the fandom that interpreted it as they were unable to feel love at all. I've even seen some commenters say that it made the Matoran feel less human, since to them love was such an intrinsically human trait. This idea being that without romance specifically, the Matoran are somehow diminished, that non-romantic love was less meaningful. Because that isn't true. There are many people who are asexual and aromantic and still experience all the profound kinds of platonic love as anyone else. And moreover, friendships can and should be thought of as wonderful, complete bonds that don't have to be thought of as lesser than romance. Now, I don't know if Greg was arguing for all of that, but I do think that at least some of that was the point he was trying to make. In any case, I think that even if romance isn't a major part of the story, Bionicle is still amazing. But in any case, whether you agree or disagree with the status of romance in Bionicle, there is something a lot of people in the fandom need to get set straight on, and that is blaming Greg Farshtey. The idea that Greg, personally and arbitrarily, decided to retcon romance out of the Matoran universe is a pretty pervasive rumor throughout the Bionicle fandom, but it just isn't true. I don't think many people in the fandom realize just how many instances Greg was not the decider, he was the messenger. And I get why. As the main author of the novels and the only member of the story team that consistently communicated directly with fans, it's easy to get the impression that Farshtey was Mr. Bionicle and making all the writing decisions for the series. But he wasn't. There was a whole story team at LEGO that plotted out the story and lore for Bionicle, one that Greg wasn't even actually a proper member of at its beginning. And while he did become a more prominent member later on, at no point was he ever the sole decision maker for the main story of the series. And with that, I think we also have to look at Greg's statements not just from a story perspective, but from a meta perspective as well. Because his statements weren't just to talk about what the Matoran do and don't feel, it was also about managing audience expectations about what would and wouldn't happen in the series. What he was saying was that Bionicle was not a romance. That's not what the story was about. The characters weren't going to be getting together. That wasn't what their arcs were. And that was something that was talked about by many members of the story team, including writers for the movies. While there may have been occasional hints of flirting, it was never going to be more than that. Establishing that they weren't actually going to get together in the canon story made it so fans weren't expecting or clamoring for that to happen, or debating which characters would end up in a pairing. And given the vicious shipping wars other fandoms have endured, I think it's a good thing Bionicle was spared that. Even in stories where romance isn't the main plot and is at best a side arc, it has a tendency to become a thing that consumes disproportionate fandom discussion. This often leaves the genuinely interesting central points of the story unattended, while the fandom puts the bulk of their focus on wishing the characters would kiss. I'm looking at you, Voltron fandom. Now, don't get me wrong, I like romance stories, and I'm a bit of a shipper myself when it comes to stories I like, including Bionicle. But I think that Bionicle's canon not having that be a focal point allowed other aspects of the story to shine. Though, to be fair, the Bionicle fandom did still end up getting focused on things that were kind of tangential to the actual, like the thousands of niche lore tidbit questions Greg got over the years, but hey, what are you going to do? We also need to acknowledge that part of the reason why we as a fandom got so stuck on Greg's statements, on romance, but also on other topics, is that for the most part, the fandom used its questions with Greg as a way to essentially ask him permission on what we could include in our own fanfiction. So when Greg said something couldn't or wouldn't happen in the main plot he was writing, fans sometimes took it as him saying that we couldn't have this happen in our own made-up stories, which was the exact opposite of the truth. Greg always said that we can and should explore whatever we want in our own stories. When he answered questions, he was answering about what he personally would or would not write in his stories that he was writing for LEGO. And when writing for LEGO's product, he had to keep in mind the target demographic, the true, ultimate reason why romance wasn't included. Despite having a notable appeal to older kids, at the end of the day, Bionicle's core demographic was elementary school boys. Those were the group that bought Bionicle sets the most, or rather, that's the group whose parents brought them Bionicle sets the most. And while LEGO was willing to include things that would appeal to Bionicle's older audience, they weren't willing to do anything that they believed would push away their primary demographic. And this seems to be something that nearly everyone who worked on Bionicle understood implicitly. According to Greg, there was never really a distinct decision among the story team to not include romance, but rather that there was never any real discussion of including it in the first place. The members of Creative Capers, the team that animated the first 3 movies, also expressed that same sentiment in an interview they did with TTV, that despite including little cute, half-flirty bits, there was never any talk of having actual serious romance. He even said that if they had wanted to pursue romantic storylines in Bionicle, they could have easily gotten around the lore reasons they established with some clever writing, but it just wasn't on the agenda and didn't get added. Now, boys that age would sometimes enjoy occasional jokey flirting in stories, like with Huki and Maku or Holly and Jolly, or jokes about someone making a fool of themselves for a crush like Matau. But it was believed that anything beyond that, such as showing characters actually date, kiss, or get married, would alienate the core audience, and I have to say they were probably right. While at that age, I know I genuinely did enjoy the hints of romance and thinking about characters having feelings and spending cute moments with each other. But I do feel like if they got significantly more mushy than that, I might have been turned off. And especially given the bulk of the fans were casual fans that enjoyed the toys more than anything, having a big prominent romance might have turned away that target demographic. But for a good while, those smaller hints of romance were everywhere in the series. But then, notably, they seem to stop being present in the story. Specifically, they stopped almost entirely after 2005, which was actually a bit of a high point for those hints of romance. In fact, 2005 was really the only point where those hints really stopped being hints and was actually a prominent plot point, such as with Rudaka and Sidderak's engagement. We have to wonder, why did it stop? Now, this is pure speculation on my point. I don't have any confirmations or quotes from Greg that even hint about this, but I do think I have some possible explanations for this shift. The first is that post-2005 marks a shift in the published material for Bionicle, where now the vast majority of published Bionicle content was written by Greg Farshtey, who famously and consistently stated that he was not going to write romance subplots in Bionicle. See, Greg wrote the novels and the comics, but before 2005, you also had the movies and Templar online animations and games, which were some of the largest sources of romantic hints and were written by their own story teams. However, Templar stopped making Bionicle content in 2004, and the movies stopped in 2005 with Web of Shadows, only coming back later in 2009. From 2006 to 2008, the canon story was only told through the books, comics, and serials, which were all written by Greg. Now, that's not to say Greg was the only one making writing decisions. There was still the main story team at LEGO coming up with the overall plot that Greg then adapted on a scene-to-scene level. But still, from this point on, Greg was doing more, and he also had relatively more seniority among the ranks of the story team at this point. However, the shift to Greg's writing doesn't fully explain the lack of romance on its own. Despite being consistent in online discussion that he wasn't looking to include romance, many of the hints of romance did actually come from Greg's writing. Most notably, Matau's clear infatuation with Nokama. Some of it, such as Matau talking about a romantic ride drive, can just be hand-waved as something from the movie script he had to include in the novelization. But the majority of it was actually stuff that wasn't in the movies at all, but stuff he chose to put into the books and comics. And there's a lot of it. So much that, as I said in the last year's Valentine's Day video, I could probably make a whole video just breaking down every moment Matau showed he was down bad for Nokama. Most of it was clearly played for laugh, as a little tongue-in-cheek joke as opposed to serious romantic development. There were at least one or two moments that could be argued were more serious. But still, the fact that Greg went from including lots of these little references in his early books, but then there was a notable absence, may suggest that there was another reason. One possible reason may have been Rudaka, and the minor controversy that some believe she stirred. See, Rudaka is the only Bionicle character that can indisputably be called sexualized, not only with her design, but also her personality and plot role. Her set is the only Bionicle toy given a distinctly feminine body features, just as the Rockshi heads on her chest armor that look like breasts, or feet being shaped like high heels and being given a ponytail, among other things. She was also animated and voiced in a way that clearly made her seductive, and notably in a very dominatrix-y type way. Just look at the way she's touching Sidderak and Vakama. Moreover, her seductiveness isn't just a quirk, it's central to the plot of that story arc. Rudaka was clearly playing the role of the femme fatale who seduces the hero into choosing the wrong path, like she did with Vakama. Rudaka and Sidderak are explicitly said to be engaged, and Rudaka was purposely using that engagement to make Sidderak think she liked him and was blind to the fact that she was going to kill him. These are pivotal aspects of the story. And while their relationship was hand-waved as something other than romantic in the books, the fact is it was played as romantic in the movie. And these are all things that parents who were watching the movie along with their kids would have picked up on. I know mine sure did. Rudaka is often noted as being one of the two most controversial Bionicle sets with parents, the other being Prydak for the blood-like red markings around his jaws. Now, it's debatable how much actual controversy either of those two actually stirred in parents. There are few to no documented complaints about them from the time. It's mostly just what's widely believed by many in the fandom. But if the rumors of Rudaka being controversial are true, that might provide an explanation as to why the hints of romance were heavily toned down going forward. They went a little too far, crossing the line from hints of crushes and going into obvious sexuality. And so to keep away any controversy and ensure that there wasn't further confusion about the status and romance of Bionicle, I believe there may have been a choice to tone down the hints of romance. I could be wrong though. There isn't a significant change in how Greg responded to questions about romance before or after 2005. He consistently claimed that there was no discussion about having or not having romance. For the most part, Greg is pretty forthright about the logic behind certain decisions made by him and LEGO. I doubt he was told by someone to tone it down, but I am willing to believe that after seeing what happened in Web of Shadows, he decided to quietly shift away so as to not give fans more false hope of romantic subplots. Though, there is actually a third potential reason, going into some very early story drafts of 2006. So, a couple years ago, big-name LEGO YouTuber Duckbricks, along with Bionicle co-creator Christian Faber, collaborated to release some never-before-seen material from Bionicle's production side. They actually got in trouble for it, since they only had permission to use Faber's personal work, not all of it. And much of the released material had to be taken down from the internet by order of LEGO. So among the materials that were shown were early character bios for the Toa Inika that, if I'm being honest, I'm pretty glad didn't stay. The Toa Igniters, as they were called early on, were going to be depicted as very jock-like dude bros who were actively competing for the affection of Ha-Li, whose role was to steer their affections in the right way so that one of them would actually use the Mask of Light. Yikes. The Toa transformation, for some reason this time, was going to act like puberty for them, and they were supposed to be struggling with new sexual feelings in their new bodies. This does contradict Greg's insistence that romance wasn't something discussed or pushed for behind the scenes. It's possible that, as very early production material, he wasn't allowed to talk about it. Though it could also be that it never actually made it to him. Greg has indicated that a lot of very early concepts or story material came and went through the story team in Denmark before any decisions actually reached him in the US. But if Greg did know about this, and this was the direction they would have taken romance if it was included in Bionicle, I think we all owe him a huge apology for sparing us for that. It's unknown how far along these ideas came before they were clearly discarded. It's also unknown if these were actually intended to be the direction for the main story. They were included in concepts for the advanced animations, which were often non-canon clips used for advertising, not events that would be depicted in the novels or comics. An example would be how the Paraka Stronghold was completely different in the animations than it was depicted in the books or comics. But for whatever reason, Bionicle ended up with a strange patchwork of romance. Hints of it appeared in the early stories without anything coming from them. In the middle, there was an engagement subplot that ended in betrayal. For the most part, the second half, hints were dumped, only to appear briefly in the absolute tail end of the story, and still nothing came of them. And then it kind of appeared in the background for the reboot in a way that was so normal it made the original seem utterly insane. But with that insanity came a real uniqueness. And that uniqueness is something that I think the fandom has a real opportunity to take and run with. Because when we look at all that we've talked about here today as a whole, it's clear that Bionicle characters sometimes have relationships that have some resemblance to human romance, but at the same time, they don't fit into the typical alloromantic sexual paradigm that our culture often assumes. What the Bionicle characters have can really be described as queer platonic relationships. And because of that, in our fan works, we can create whole new relationship dynamics and structures unique to them. Instead of arguing over whether romance as we assume it is canon or not, let's think really creatively about the ways in which this fictional alien society could develop their close relationships. They develop close relationships based on their bonds and a desire to be with each other. But at the same time, they don't necessarily live together. So, would they even have reasons to make their relationships exclusive? Very rarely, it seems, they feel some kind of strong innate attraction, but they don't even have words for it. Marriage exists in some of their cultures, but it's mainly to secure alliances and transfer status. Would there be societal taboos against getting too deep into a relationship, particularly between different elements? in places like Metronui, where one's work came first and everything personal came second? Would those taboos end up loosened on Motunui, or would they be even tighter, given that travel between the villages was even more dangerous? And how would their ideas be challenged and changed when they encounter the Agori, who do have more traditional romance and sex? Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'm really interested to see what kind of ideas we can come up with. But that has been my deep dive into romance and Bionicle. As you can see, I had a lot to talk about. This topic ended up being so much more fascinating to me than I realized it would be going into it. And I already thought it would be interesting. And be sure to tune in soon-ish for a follow-up to this where I look at a more fanon side to this by exploring the more popular Bionicle romantic ships among the fandom. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all soon. Take care, my gathered friends.